how does your story impact your marriage, especially your sexual story? We're going to talk about that on this episode today. I'm Dr. Carol. Thank you for joining me here on Relationship Prescriptions. You may notice, if you've been listening or watching for a bit, that I'm in a different place. I am here at the Focus on the Family headquarters in Colorado Springs at the Sexual Integrity Leadership Summit, which Focus is hosting. And they have graciously made this space available where we're having this conversation today. And I have a very special guest joining me, Stacey Sadler Smith, who has done, well, she's just done a lot of things. But we are going to talk about relationships and trauma and repair and story, and we'll just get into all of that kind of stuff. But maybe to start with, Stacey, just welcome.
Thank you. So glad to be here.
And then let me just give you a moment to introduce yourself to our audience.
Okay. Well, I am a therapist in Houston, Texas. I'm also Chief Clinical Officer for Daring Ventures. And we work with sex addiction and betrayal trauma. And so my team does a lot of disclosures and grief work and couples work with couples. We also have a partner intensive program that is a week-long retreat, and I'm the program director for that. I also do training for APSATS, which is the Association of Partners of Sex Addicts Trauma Specialists. And all those letters mean that I train other therapists and coaches to deal with betrayal trauma and how to treat betrayal trauma so as not to pathologize or treat clients that are dealing with betrayal in an unhealthy way. And so, I speak about betrayal trauma with New Life Ministries, and I'm on their board. So, I've got my hands in a few things.
Yeah. The first time I actually heard you was on the New Life radio program.
Oh, really?
I don't get to listen all the time now, but I remember hearing you some years ago, being one of their people. And now we've met in person and here at SILS this week.
Yeah.
What, for heaven's sake, led you to get into dealing with this hard stuff? These are hard things.
Yes, it really is. And it's not anything you ever go toward.
Yes.
It's something that calls you. And out of my own story, basically we were just talking about before we started, like a microphone got put in my hand at New Life, and they said, tell your story. And I was like, my story, like, I don't qualify for this. I wasn't married to a sex addict. And they were like, just tell your story. And I was still processing my story and what happened in my story. And so as it unfolded, it was like, oh, I had elements of betrayal. I had elements of addiction. I had elements of my own victim-y kind of codependent trauma behavior. And so as that went on and I learned about treating people with betrayal trauma, I was like, I get this because it was part of what I didn't get as I was treated within the church. But then also there were elements that I did get from some safe people. So it just sort of called me and pulled me into it. And I knew that's what God had for me.
Yeah. I am especially interested in story and how that impacts people's, sexuality or their relationships, their marriage. A lot of what you are dealing with is sexual betrayal in marriage. And certainly that is a story. But I want to get into some of the pre-story, perhaps,
Okay.
And maybe just let you start talking about how does somebody's history years ago, whether that's childhood or growing up or their early experiences, how does that impact just their awareness of what the risks may be now when they get married, the risks of betrayal, or how they may respond if there's some signs of betrayal. I know that's a big question, but let's just start going there.
So I think when you from the very beginning, attachment starts.
Yes.
The way God designed it is a baby and a mother and the eye gaze and attunement. And that baby starts deciding whether they're safe or not with mama's gaze and whether he can rely on mama to be there, to come back, to soothe him. And everything is built out of that.
Yeah.
Everything is built out of that. And so people aren't perfect.
Yeah.
Right? And there are ruptures in that relationship. And out of that grows independence. If I know that I can come back to this secure base, I can venture out into the world and come back and know I'll be okay. And that develops a healthy child.
Yeah.
If I know that I can feel in those relationships and be okay feeling and be okay being imperfect, then I am going to come back with a good self-image. However, there's a lot of ways that can be ruptured in this world.
Yes.
Not even purposely or consciously, but we live in a world where things happen, right? And some of those early attachment, we get attachment wounds because attachment is broken. There's divorce, there's addiction. In my family, there was alcohol addiction. And so I grew up in a relatively healthy home where my perception was my parents were saviors to everybody.
Oh, yeah.
My mom was a Christian. My dad was Jewish. But as he got sober in the AA program very early in my life, everybody thought they were amazing people. And I lived with these saints. And my dad ended up finding Jesus through the 12 steps. So I lived with this sense of my parents are perfect and I've got to live up to that.
Yeah.
You know, went off to college, started having a heck of a great time, Baptist mom, you know, AA dad, and I had my parents up on a pedestal.
Okay.
But I watched my mom do a lot of pleasing and not talking about her emotions. So I became a pleaser. And I think that if we have trauma, if we have things that happened earlier in our lives, it starts setting the stage for us to be vulnerable to pain and to bad relationships as we go through life. And so how we think about ourselves as sexual human beings and what sex is about, and in my family, it was not discussed.
And you said so much, Stacey, in those few minutes, and I just got to pause. You and every one of us, you learn things about all these areas long before you knew you were learning anything. You learned about sex before the word was even said. You learned about relationships and intimacy and communication or lack thereof. And what do you do with feelings? Maybe you don't do feelings.
Right.
You learned about conflict resolution or not. You learned what was okay and what wasn't. And those are deep brain pathways that grow in a young person long before they even know it's happening. You referenced attachment. Is the world relatively safe or is it not? Can I approach people? Can I get my needs met or not? Do I have to claw at things?
Right.
Or do I just give up? All of those things are unconscious before you know you're learning them.
Implicit.
Yes.
We call them implicit, and we react to them without thinking.
Yeah.
They just happen. And it's all in our nervous systems. So we're walking nervous systems, either attracting or not attracting what we need or what we don't want, and all that we take into our relationships. So what I brought into relationship was be a nice little Christian girl who I had an image of fantasy of what marriage should look like.
Yeah.
And ended up marrying an addict.
Wow.
Just like my dad.
Wow.
And so, and before that were a lot of, not healthy relationships and very low self-esteem. And so it's been a life of repairing that, and it's still a journey. It's still a journey to today. So yes, I think all of those, I don't think that everybody that's impacted by sex addiction and betrayal trauma has family of origin trauma. I think we have issues that we have to understand about ourselves. What did I come to believe? What's feeding the dysfunction in my life? I think self-awareness is, why do I do what I do?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. You deal a lot, again, with people who are walking through betrayal in marriage. And we'll get back to story in a minute, but for people who may have heard the term betrayal trauma, but maybe they don't quite understand, or is it a real thing, and kind of dismiss it, or am I feeling that myself?
Yes.
Would you just talk for a minute about betrayal trauma, validate somebody who maybe is asking those questions about themselves, and just what that experience is like?
Sure. So like I talked about the first most important relationship with mother-baby, the second most important relationship, I'm not counting out dads, but is your marriage relationship.
Yeah.
And when that relationship is shattered by betrayal, it upsets the very core foundation of what you know and believe about yourself, to the point where most of my clients get diagnosed with post-traumatic stress disorder, because all of the symptoms in the Diagnostic and Statistics Manual that we use as our Bible to diagnose people are there in betrayed partners. They're foggy thinking, they're hypervigilant, they're avoiding places, at beaches. They don't go to beaches. They don't go down certain roads. Some of them get agoraphobia and can't even go out. Their bodies are affected. I talked about the autonomic nervous system. Yeah. They have gastric problems. They have headaches. They have tension in their shoulders. And so it truly affects everything they do. And for a lot of clinicians and going into therapy office, they get labeled as crazy or borderline personality disorder, because their emotions are erratic and they're all over the place, and they're checking and they're, looking to see what their husbands are doing, and people are calling them snooppervising, and they're controlling all these behaviors. All they're doing is seeking safety and trying to find what blew up in my world. We have an assumptive reality that we live in, where we assume our place in the world, and that brings us safety, just like mama, baby again. And betrayal blows that up. So we've got to make meaning out of what happened. And if you have a husband that's been acting out for many, many years, your brain is working overtime to figure out what in the world happened, and where do I fit into that, and what was real and what wasn't real. And that, in a nutshell, is betrayal trauma. It's messy, it's hard, it's unfair, it's painful.
Yeah.
It's multi-layered.
Yeah. I am thinking of someone who has reached out to me, and we've had some conversations, and I'll make this general, but she had been married before. That marriage ended. Now she has been in a relationship with a man for about 5 years, and he is not been faithful to her. But she cannot imagine leaving. And she said to me, I need love so much. And as we were talking, she expressed how she had never really experienced a secure attachment growing up. And now this man that she's trying to make this relationship work with, she feels moments when he's giving her something, but then it always gets broken, and it never follows through. And we were talking about how her past story is impacting how she's responding to the very, very broken place she finds herself in now.
Yes, it's a legitimate need, isn't it? She wants that connection. She wants to be seen. She wants to be cherished. She wants to be loved. But the cavern inside of her is from a wound from childhood. And that can't be filled by a human being. Right? I mean, attachment, we want that. We want that in our marital relationships. But what the hunger, the soul hunger that she has, only Christ can fill, and only she can fill with healing what was broken and what she never got before.
I'm thinking that it's probably almost everybody, if not everybody, who ends up either responding with, betrayal trauma, with trying to stick around and not feeling validated enough to make some hard choices, or even the betrayer. Nobody wakes up and says, I am going to mess up my marriage and my life and my relationship with God. All that comes from somewhere.
Right.
And if all we do as Christian helpers, frankly, in the body of Christ, if all we do is say, oh, shape up, you got to do this, and never deal with where that came from, we're missing so much that people need to get to wholeness.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And it all comes out of woundedness.
Yes.
And if my partner betrays me, I'm going to be angry.
Sure.
And we're going to deal with that. But eventually we're going to get to, where is the wound that you were trying to medicate with sex? Where is the wound you were trying to medicate with love and connection, right? And that's the work. That's the deep work, to begin to understand those wounded places.
Yeah. In your own story, or in the many people you've talked with, Stacey, for somebody who might feel like, oh, going to those deep, dark places, I'm going to be sucked into a vortex and I'm never going to get out. If I once let those emotions come up, I'm going to drown and I'm never going to get through it. Talk about that for a minute.
Well, my dad used to say, she's a feeler. She's a feeler. And I was like, my dad, he was a feeler. So when I have clients that can't feel, it's tough for me because I just wear them right out here. You just know who I am because my feelings are on my sleeves. But there is a real fear of that. And I would say that's a very young fear.
Yes.
Because we don't have what it takes, if we don't have what it takes to know how to deal with emotions. And so the first thing I'm going to do is help those clients understand how to manage their emotions instead of just block them off.
Yes.
That we can feel them and then we can contain their emotions. We can feel them just a little bit and come back. And I have to teach them how to do that, how to just feel just a little bit, and they survived.
Yes.
It didn't kill them, right? And then they could feel a little bit more and it wouldn't kill them. And if we bury those feelings, we bury them alive. And if we bury the bad ones, we bury the good ones too, and the joy and the peace and the goodness that can come. Because we think we're at peace, but we're really not at peace. They're down there grumbling.
And doesn't it take a lot of brain calories to keep all that stuffed?
Absolutely it does. And it comes out wonky. Usually it comes out as anxiety, and people don't even know they're anxious. I didn't know I was anxious for a long, long time, but being able to address it, grief, I say people don't make an appointment with grief, but we need to. We need to. There was a session here at the Sexual Integrity Leadership Summit on lament.
Yes.
And I went the other day because there's just some things I need to lament. And someone said, oh, did you hear Stacey's dealing with something? And I'm like, aren't we always dealing with something?
Yes.
Just the mere fact that I work with betrayed partners and sex addicts every day, I'm carrying a big load of vicarious trauma.
Yes.
And I need to let that out. It is sad and it is hard what we deal with every single day.
Yes.
It shouldn't be a unicorn that I'm going to cry a few tears. I need to.
Yeah, that's good. And I just got to do a sidebar there for a second. I would never have imagined God would invite me to speak or deal with any of these things. But as I have, I feel the weight. And I remember, it was some weeks ago, I remember walking out on my back porch and I say, God, can I just not talk about sex for a while, please? Please?
Yeah.
It's
He's
hard.
funny about that.
Yeah.
I know. And I'm like, really? I'm going to be interviewed and talking about sex. And it causes you to question everything about yourself and your story. Yeah. And that's why I say it's continual work.
Yeah.
Every time I come, I go, I got to work on that. Or, okay, what do you have for me here, God? Because we're wounded healers and we're always looking. I'm trying to always look. Sometimes I hide from God and I've got to look at that.
Yeah. Yeah.
It's challenging.
Yeah, it is. Yeah. I am glad you started with talking about the attachment between mother and child. And we've learned a lot about attachment and attachment theory, and that's continued to grow and be important. As we are thinking about betrayal and betrayal trauma and sex and sexuality, would you relate attachment and sex? Would you unpack how, at least I believe that when our attachments are less than whole, trying to go to sex can be a way of trying to meet attachment needs that aren't all there. And so it may not be sex per se, that it's kind of seeking for something that's not.
Right. It's weirdly intertwined but different.
Yeah, sure.
Our bodies have, there's attachment hormones like oxytocin that really cause bonding.
Yeah.
And then there's other hormones that are secreted during sex that are not necessarily bonding hormones. So, like I said, it's intertwined, but we can have sex and not be connected to our bodies or each other.
Yes.
And so people aren't taught how to attach and attune to each other. So in my couples work, I'm being trained in PACT, which is the psychobiological approach to couples therapy. I'm having them look eye to eye. We're having attunement right now as we talk, and I'm looking at your eyes, and we're connecting, and we're talking. And when your eyes get teary, my eyes get teary, and that's attunement. And I have couples that can't hold eye gaze and can't look at each other. And we're having them approach at a certain, how does that feel? Does it feel invasive? And why? And what in your childhood makes that feel invasive? And what feels better and why? And how does that feel to you? Does that feel like you're being rejected? And all those things are happening in our bodies. And so sex is impacted.
Yes.
And how do we come together and be fully known? In the garden, before, when we look about sin created separation and hiding and covering. And you think about betrayal trauma and sex addiction and lying and hiding and all of those things, that's a result of the fall,
yes.
right?
Yes.
And so what we've got to correct is coming together and being fully known, because that's vulnerability. And that's terrifying.
Yes.
Because you might hurt me. You might reject me.
And it's true. You really might.
Absolutely.
You really might.
But that's the cost of love.
Yes.
And it is terrifying.
Yep.
And if we can just say, I am scared. And I'm so scared that I'm trusting you, because when we give our fragile heart to the person we love, there's a risk.
Yeah. Yeah.
It's a risk. So being able to have those conversations, I'm newly married. I'm less than a year married.
Wow.
And I'm the therapist that comes in and goes, okay, you got to hold me for 6 seconds because I need that oxytocin. We need that oxytocin. Would you open your eyes? Would you look at me? And I'm doing all of these things, but I'm having to be brave and bold in having these conversations. Hey, this is what I think a healthy marriage should look like, because we've never experienced that. And making that happen, having the risk of having that conversation, I have to jump up against, feeling rejected, feeling like too much when I have those conversations. But that's my challenge, to jump in and be vulnerable.
I'm glad you said that, Stacey. First of all, congratulations.
Thank you.
But you've alluded to briefly earlier in our conversation, you've been through stuff, in your family of origin, but certainly in your prior marriage, addiction and betrayal and all of that. What's it been like to make the choice to be vulnerable again and do the work to build? I can imagine it's both processes in your own brain that need to be, even though intellectually you've been a therapist, you know what's required to build healthy vulnerability and bonding and intimacy and what goes on in your own brain, but still to feel it for yourself.
Right, yeah. Well, it helps to have a safe person.
Yes.
And I have an amazing man. My husband's amazing. And but from the beginning, I asked him really hard questions, and I had lots of moments of triggers for myself.
Yes.
And I had to say to him, I need to ask you some really hard questions, and I need to ask them as often as I can ask them. And I just told him the other day, I said, look, with this population that I work with, I start making up stories in my head, and I need to tell you the stories that I'm making up in my head. And he said, honey, you ask me anything that you want. And I said, there's an enemy out there who would love to take me down because of what I do.
Right.
And this is the place he would hit. So I need to know, I need to ask you some questions, because I make up stories in my head. And that's what we say all the time. I'm making up a story in my head.
Yeah.
Is that true? Because this is how I feel about it. And that's vulnerable to say that. And so we've worked through that together, and he's learning to do that as well. And so it's been hard but good, but very reparative. In the beginning, I remember one day I pulled down the toilet paper above the toilet, and it fell in the toilet. And I was like, and I said to him, "You're going to kill me." And he's like, "I'm going to kill you for dropping the toilet paper in the thing?" Yeah, because I would have been blamed before. And then later that day, we're fisher people. We love to fish. And we got to this spot, and I had just caught a big fish, and they were biting, and I was so excited. And I threw my line out there, and it got caught in the trolling motor because I was premature, before we were getting where we were getting. And I was shuddering,
got triggered,
waiting
big
to get in
time.
trouble.
Yes.
And he looked at me, And he said, honey, these things happen. And I just started crying. And I just said, I would have really been in trouble with that before. And so poor guy has to hear about my story all the time because I have to tell it all the time. I don't tell my story because I've been accused of telling my story because I hate him and I want to get back. I haven't. I've forgiven him. I have to tell my story because people demand it. My clients demand to know that I've been there and I get it. And so I have to keep telling my story. And my story is where Jesus is. My story is where my woundedness is where I really met my Savior.
Yeah.
And where I learned all of those things. And even in telling that story, that's where it's redeemed today with my new relationship.
Yeah. I saw your eyes get moist, Stacey, is talking about the experience of having him receive that moment from you without getting angry and blaming. And that, in a sense, was new for you.
Very.
It was repairing something in your brain.
100%.
For somebody who may right now be stuck working through betrayal with their partner, or whatever the kind of brokenness is in a relationship that needs repair, would you talk a bit about the repair process, both in our own brain and then between people? I'm not a psychologist with a psychological degree, but I've kind of geeked out a little bit on some of this brain stuff
so
recently
fun,
as I found out about it.
I know.
And the repair process fascinates me.
Okay,
And it is beautiful,
and
and it's a picture of the gospel. So would talk about that for a minute.
Well, working with couples, sometimes, he'll say, I didn't do the betraying.
Yeah.
And maybe that's the truth. But her ex-husband did. Why do I have to pay for it? And I teach them how they don't have to pay for it, but they have that opportunity to repair it.
Okay.
And it's beautiful. And when I think about the opportunity that exists for us to reparent ourselves and for our mates to come in and attune to us to repair those broken places, I think about how redemptive it is of God. Our brains are made with neuroplasticity.
Yes.
And it's the coolest thing.
Yes.
Because what we learned that was broken in those neural pathways can be re-cemented. I always say, it's like getting off a ski lift and our brains go down that neural pathway like that. There's the old groove in the snow.
Yeah, that's good.
So if we get off and we create a new pathway, like the first time it's a little hard, but now the second time we get off, there's a new way to go, an option. And our brains don't like negatives. So if there's a positive way to go, we can retrain our brains to go a new positive way. And that's repair.
Yeah.
And that's redemptive.
Yes.
And that's God.
Yes.
Giving us new beliefs. And we are constantly working against those negative cognitions that are built in. I'm too much. I'm stupid. I'm not enough. I'm broken. To recreate those new beliefs. And yes, we can say those beliefs, but there's got to be some implicit work done on those implicit systems because I don't know. I didn't mean to get scared.
Right.
It just happened.
Right.
And in the moment when I can have a new experience that's reparative, it's fixed.
Yes.
It's powerful.
Right brain, left brain stuff is part of this. The new pathway of connecting your right brain to something new that even if you intellectually believe you haven't experienced yet, for your right brain to have that experience to make that connection.
Yes.
And maybe just the last point I'll bring up in our conversation, repairing our relationship with God. Not that God needs repair. He hasn't betrayed us. But I'm sure you have seen, as I have, that many who have walked through hard things, their nervous system, at least part of them, feels like God has let them down.
Yeah.
Talk a bit about repairing that. At least that's our perception as humans.
Right. Well, and I think we have to unpack it.
Right.
Because for me, God never let me down. But I thought he did.
Right.
And I wrote my famous angry letter to God. And I
Good.
cussed in that letter, Carol. And I let him have it.
Good.
And as I did it, I realized, oh, he didn't promise me a marriage. I was so mad at him for letting that happen to my marriage.
Right.
And so I didn't understand. I thought God promised me that he would restore my marriage.
And you asked him.
And I asked him 100 times, and I really thought he gave me a rhema promise to restore my marriage. I added a little in to the rhema promise that he who started a good work in me would be faithful to complete it. And somebody told me, Stacey, I think that's just for you. I don't think it's for your marriage. And I said, no, he said it was for my marriage. That was a little tagline I added on.
Yeah.
And usually it's people interfering,
Right.
not Jesus,
Right.
not God. But we have to work that out in a safe space. I remember one client who was very angry at God and had just shut down all of her relationship or spiritual relationship. Well, number one, her pastor came on to her.
Oh,
and
ouch. We could go there for an hour.
We could go. I know. We already talked about. We could just talk about this forever. But and so there were components of that. But she said, "How come God never told me?" Her husband showed up on the front page of the paper for solicitation of prostitution.
Wow.
And she said, "How come God never told me?" And so as I'm doing EMDR with her, I can tell you a fact and it not sink in.
Yep.
But as we're doing the kind of therapy that I do, which is a trauma therapy, eye movement, desensitization, and reprocessing, which we're in the memory network, we're working on it, I carefully snuck in. And what year were you diagnosed with that sexually transmitted disease? And because we were in that neuro pathway, she goes, he did try to tell me. But see, she had a denial blocker there.
Wow.
Yeah. So it takes a while to unpack that trauma and unpack it with someone safe that gets it and that it's okay to question God. If we look at the Bible, it's always okay to question God.
Yeah.
Because guess what? He can stand up to our questioning because he wins in the end and he can handle it. And I wanted to say something else that I meant to say a minute ago. If you can't, I wanted to repair ruptures within my original marriage. And I tried, 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 and I tried.
Yes.
And I tried to pray it to happen, and I finally had to surrender that to God.
Yes.
And so sometimes it can be repaired in the original marriage, an original relationship. And then sometimes I had to repair it for myself with God, with community.
Yes.
For myself for 10 years of being single. And now I'm getting this icing on the cake with this redemptive relationship.
Yeah.
But either way, it can change. And that's the hope that I want to give.
And thank you for saying that, that you have a vote, but if your spouse votes no, God, I use the phrase, he may release you. God may release you.
And he did.
From that marriage.
Yes.
And that can be life-saving.
It was life-saving.
Yes. Yeah. Well, Stacey, this has been beautiful and rich, and I so appreciate it. For somebody who may have just been intrigued by some of the things you've said and wants to find out more, where might they come find you or connect with you?
Well, my website is still www.staceysadler.com.
And we'll have that in the links.
Yes.
Yep.
And I also work for Daring Ventures. So, daringventures.com, you can find me and all of our wonderful programs that we do through Daring Ventures.
Yeah. We'll have those links in the show notes. Thank you. This has been so beautiful.
Thank you, Carol. It's been an honor.
Yeah. For those of you who have joined us, thank you. If you're still here at the end, really appreciate it. Do check the links under this video if you're watching. Check the links in the show notes if you're listening. And connect with Stacey, Daring Ventures. And I'm going to put the link to New Life there also, that Stacey is often a part of. And I've enjoyed listening to New Life whenever I can. I would also love to hear from you myself. You can come to drcarolministries.com. Use the contact page there. That gets to me confidentially. And you may have been aware of my latest book, Sexpectations, Reframing Your Good and Not So Good Stories About God, Love, and Relationships. This isn't about what's right or wrong, although we're not afraid to talk about sin, but this is about the things that you experienced and then how you may have acted in response and what it looks like to bring Jesus into that story in a very practical way. You can find out more at yoursexpectations.com as well. I want to thank you again for joining us, and I want to thank Focus on the Family for making this space available, and the Sexual Integrity Leadership Summit for bringing Stacey and I to the same place at the same time.
Yes.
And until next time, may God bless you.